Apparently for the video, I'm supposed to sit. Um, but yeah, my name is Theresa Laverty. I'm a new assistant professor at New Mexico State University. Um, Froen had invited me out here to help with some bat research, and I brought along Cecilia Montalban. Is that how you say it? Who's originally from Peru, but is doing her PhD in the UK on bats in Ghana and Zambia. So we just came from the African Small Mammal Symposium in Swakopmund. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my PhD work, which was at Colorado State University, but took place in the Kunene region out here in Namibia. Okay, so this is geared a little bit more towards an American audience, just so we're aware. I don't think I need to explain so much of this to you, but when people typically think of biodiversity, they think of a scene on the left, these hot, humid, very wet tropical forests. And very few people think of a desert landscape as being biodiverse. But, I'm wondering if I can hide this. Video panel. Oh, that's not video panel. Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. We know, of course, that deserts are incredibly diverse in their own ways. They are resource limited. They have less productivity than our hot tropical forests. But they oftentimes harbor a high number of endemic species or species that are well adapted to arid environments. Let me get back here. And this is true for a number of different wildlife species. For today, I'm going to focus on bats. Bats, if you're unaware, they make up about 20% of the world's mammals. About half of all mammals are bats or rodents. So 1 in 5 mammals is a bat, is a good kind of way to think about this. They make up a variety of different foraging guilds, everything from insect-eating bats to fruit-eating to nectar and frog and fish and sometimes even bat-eating bats. And so if you're interested in studying community ecology, bats or rodents, if you're interested in mammals, are really great groups of species to study. And so they're going to be the stars of today's talk. But I was particularly interested in the ecological and social factors that structure wildlife populations and communities in desert ecosystems with a focus on bats. And I'm going to walk through 3 different parts of the study that took place out here. And we'll start with bats and water in the northern Namib Desert. So of course we know that deserts have limited water availability. In fact, one of the key defining features of a desert is that there's high interannual variation in rainfall across these systems. They can be hot or cold. Today we're focusing on the Namib. This is actually a photo from just next door here, where you're able to see that water, surface water in particular, particularly during the dry season or drought years, really acts to concentrate numbers of species and numbers of individuals. And this is true not just for diurnal animals, but also for nocturnal ones. So one of the first things that many bats tend to do in arid environments when they wake up in the evening is to go and visit a water hole. This can be both for drinking, which takes place, as you're seeing here, on the wing. They do not land like birds do, or some birds do, to take a sip. Or they can also be around these habitats for foraging opportunities, particularly for insectivorous bats. And I will point out the majority of bats are insectivorous, and the majority across the world, including in deserts. Now, of course, we know that surface water isn't all the same from site to site. So if you're familiar with the Huab River, this is Peter's Pool down the Huab River, and you can see that there's a really strong salt layer around this body of water. Cattle come and drink here. Not a ton of other things hang out here, occasionally elephants, occasionally lions. But interestingly enough, we actually get bats drinking here. Now, bats, for their body size and high metabolic rates, may be more sensitive to changes in water quality than other mammals might be. So being larger bodied, you'd be able to maybe be buffered against poor water quality. And so I wanted to test the hypothesis that these small bodied mammals with really high metabolic rates when they're active might be good bioindicators of water quality. And so for this work, I was focused in the Kunene region just adjacent to Skeleton Coast National Park. I think we had one site just within the park on a series of ephemeral river channels. And I don't need to explain too much to you guys here, but this is a river system that you're seeing down the center of your screen. It's actually the Namib River, which of course the headwaters are just around here. But the more permanent forms of water in the landscape exist as natural springs in this system and artificial pools or boreholes. So in this part of Namibia, the boreholes are often constructed to supplement elephants in particular away from human settlements. So there's a series along the Namib River, a couple then that are focused at some of these fly-in tourism camps, but really they're there to supplement wildlife, especially when they're this low to the ground. So I asked the question, how does water quality and availability then relate to bat diversity and activity in this system? And to do so, one other thing, and are there seasonal differences? Because as you're all probably well aware, there can be really important or like very obvious differences between dry seasons and drought years and wet seasons across the same landscapes. And the reason why I was particularly interested in some of this work is because, of course, species like bats and elephants would be drinking from the same water holes. In this part of the Kunene, a lot of times the boreholes that people rely on break, either due to elephants or other things interfering with the systems. And so it's not uncommon for people and their livestock to also be collecting water from the exact same water holes that wildlife are using. And so it's all kind of tied together, which obviously has implications for human, livestock, and animal health in the system. And just for people who are online, this is published, and I'm happy to share this if anyone has any trouble accessing any of the articles I talk about today. I just really want to highlight at the beginning of each study that when I say I or we, all of this stuff was not me on my own, but rather a subset of people, including a master's student at the University of Namibia and her advisor, Dr. Sefasebe, as well as collaborators like Archie Gabusab and my then colleagues in the US. So this study took place over 23 bodies of water, 5 of which were boreholes and 18 were springs across largely the Namib to Huab River systems, although we had some north and south of those. And while I was in Namibia for 1.5 years continuously, I really focused the water sampling at the height of the dry, hot season. Rains hadn't started before January of 2017, and so I collected water for the dry season between November and January, and wet season then kind of towards the end of the rainy season in 2017. And I had these analyzed in Windhoek for a number of different factors. The kind of standard water kit includes things like pH and conductivity, concentrations of 11 different minerals and ions, and this includes things like calcium, fluoride, sodium, chloride, kind of you name it. And in general, higher concentrations of all these minerals and ions are indicative usually of poor water quality. As people, you may know that we oftentimes are looking for a tiny bit of fluoride in our water, but high concentrations of fluoride are actually pretty detrimental for our health in different ways. And I'm not going to talk about it today. For the wet season, I also analyzed for heavy metals. There wasn't something like totally surprising in the system, so I'm going to ignore that for now. So the lab in Windhoek that had analyzed these looked at them across the Department of Water Affairs standards, and these are standards for human health, and found that of the 46 water samples, 23 bodies of water sampled once in each season. None of them fell into excellent quality. Most of them were noted as unsuitable for human consumption, and they also have a second standard that's unsuitable for livestock consumption. And I'd say about a third of that last bar actually fell in there. So there are differences in water quality across these sites. I was curious, are these seasonally related or are they due to the different type of body of water? And found in short, using a principal components analysis, that there weren't any statistical differences between these two factors. In fact, water quality tends to cluster based more on river system, which makes sense due to the differences in the underlying geology of these systems. So we know that water quality varies, but there wasn't like a strong seasonal or type of body of water factor there, but we want to know how then the variation affects bat biodiversity. And to do this, I relied on acoustic surveys. So I think you guys are probably pretty familiar with acoustic surveys, but from these, you're able to put out these microphones and systems that then record frequency over time, or these are the spectrograms or sonograms that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen there. And an important thing to note is that different species, not all the time, but oftentimes can be identified individually based on their calls because they have different shapes and frequencies. And to give you an idea of how that looks in Namibia, sorry, this isn't the best quality, but you can see like Hippoceterus kafer is all the way up around 136 kilohertz. The Rhinolophus are really easy to identify. But yeah, there's not, unfortunately, a call library that exists currently for bats in Namibia. They're working on one for South Africa, but to be honest, I think it still has a lot of work that needs to be done. And so in order to confirm which species were being acoustically recorded, this was paired with misnetting that occurred during different times of that 1.5 year sampling. So the nights I collected water quality, I also had up these acoustic detectors all night long. Thankfully, the elephants didn't mess with them those 46 nights. And then on other nights of the year, I was also had acoustic sampling and misnetting going on at the same time to be able to kind of confirm which species exist in this landscape. And to give you an idea, this is just for the insectivorous bats. The fruit bats that we have in Namibia do not echolocate. So you're only able to detect these insectivorous bats using ultrasonic frequencies here. You have a really diverse species assemblage. It's not really high in terms of number of species maybe, but there's a lot of different families represented here. Everything from your free-tailed bats, your horseshoe bats, your vesper bats. Sestugo cibre is actually in its own family. There's only 2 species in it. So it's a cool place to work if you're interested in studying bats. So from those acoustic survey results, on those 46 nights at 23 bodies of water, we had a little over 120,000 passes, where 16 different species were represented. There were no statistical differences in terms of species richness based on the season or the water body type. However, activity almost doubled during the wet season, and it was almost double at boreholes compared to natural springs, which kind of begs a question of whether or not these boreholes could actually be used for bat conservation in these landscapes. But I want to point out that of those 16 species, 6 of them were only recorded at natural springs. And so it is quite possible that where we have man-made implemented water, we may be bringing in more mesic adapted bats, ones that are from wetter landscapes. And the true desert specialist might only occur at a couple of these sites. So tying this all together, there's seasonal differences in activity, not so much in species richness, but how does water quality then tie in? To do this, I used a generalized linear model and was relying on that principal components analysis that I didn't show you just for the sake of not having to explain too many graphs. But to quickly walk you through, because water quality features are highly correlated with one another, I ran the data through a principal components analysis. So each PC is orthogonal, each principal component is orthogonal to one another, and so they should not be related to one another. And it makes very good use in data analysis when you're assuming things are independent. PC1 was associated with higher salinity. PC2 was associated with higher iron and calcium concentrations. PC3 was more a function of the surface area of water size. And then the responses that we were testing, we're looking at the community level, overall species richness and bat activity. And then at the species specific level, for those species with more than 1,000 total passes, so number of recordings in a night, that were recorded on at least 50% of the sampling nights, we were trying to see if any of those species activity-wise was related to any of these factors. So at the community level, we did find that water salinity negatively impacted overall species richness. So that Peters Pool picture that I showed you earlier was associated with much fewer species than you would find at less saline bodies of water. And this was particularly true during the dry season when animals are really restricted to these permanent bodies of water. And this was in agreement with our hypothesis that bats might be indicators of water quality. However, at the species level, we found that activity was really variable species to species and across seasons. For free-tailed bats, the family Molossidea, there were 2 species that made up a lot of our calls and a lot of our captures. This is Robert's flat-headed bat on the left and the Egyptian free-tailed bat on the right. They tend to be these open-air foragers that are really fast flyers. They're not the most maneuverable bats, and so they oftentimes are looking for larger surface areas to access water. And we found that relationship to be true for these 2 species. However, there wasn't really a great species that was associated with water quality. The Nearomycia zuluensis, the Zulu serentine, sort of matched it, but it was not enough data that I would say that this is a great indicator of good water quality in the system. So what I take from this is that these community level responses, how many bats you get and how many activity at a site, can really be a better indicator of what makes a good site for water quality in these systems. So that kind of wraps up that part. I will say that there are cases across Namibia where cyanide poisoning can happen, and I'm particularly interested, closer to Swakopmund, where you have these uranium mines, like how the water runoff there might be affecting things like birds and bats. Oftentimes they're flying in and leaving, and you're not really sure if water quality can be directly implicated in survival there. But I do think that there's a strong case for it. And it will be affecting a number of different species, but particularly these probably smaller bodied species. So shifting gears, but staying in the same system, I also was interested, the thing that actually got me involved in working in bats, which I only started working with them during my PhD, was my interest in how large herbivores affect the landscape. So the Namib Desert is one of like maybe 2 deserts that have a really intact herbivore community. Everything from your mega herbivores down to your little bakis. And of course, there's a lot of pastoralist group ranching that goes on in these areas as well. And that tends to happen in a number of different arid and semi-arid systems. Now, when we think of food webs, we usually think of top-down effects where predators are controlling the number of herbivores on the landscape, and that this then in consequence has impacts on vegetation. But we know that in desert systems, these typically are thought to be pretty low relative to the amount of rainfall a system receives. And so actually the number of herbivores on a system are going to affect the predator populations in the sense that predator populations can't really keep track without these herbivores on the landscape, which tend to multiply more in wetter, more productive years, or have lag effects from that. So a paper that I had kind of really shaped some of the study was one by Payne in the Journal of Mammalogy, who was highlighting that there aren't just these top-down effects from predators in systems, but there could be these indirect effects from mammalian herbivores in food webs. He was thinking more about this. He's the whole sea star kind of person, so thinking more about this in the intertidal zones. But of course, this can be something that we see on the landscape. And so Keith Leggett had published about the elephants in Kunene in particular, how they don't necessarily affect the vegetation on the landscape in general in this region, but around bodies of water, he called it a sacrifice zone, where the species of vegetation that we find and also like the amount of vegetation in general can be shaped by herbivores in the system. So, of course, we know that desert rivers are where we find the majority of our vegetation in systems, and so particularly around bodies of permanent water, there can be huge impacts from very few species, very few individuals on the landscape around bodies of water. So I was curious in how these herbivores might be affecting other levels of the food web, and particularly was interested in insectivores and studying bats. So we thought there might be large, either direct or indirect effects on bats. Elephants, rhinos, giraffe, you know, they bring biting flies with them. Also, their dung provides habitat for insects. There could be indirect effects, though, of course. We know that elephants are ecosystem engineers that kind of reshape the vegetation community around certain areas. And that these effects might be strongly modified by seasonal factors, because we know that when the rains come, the elephants disappear in many of our areas where they cluster during the dry season. So this work again has been published, and I'm happy to pass it on to anyone if they need access. So we were studying the relationship between mega herbivores, insectivores, and riparian vegetation around bodies of water in the system. I would have loved to add insects in, but I was having the hardest time keeping them in like 40-degree heat in my baki in the Namib. So maybe down the road, I will think of a more constructive way to kind of actually be able to store something that doesn't just smell and become mush right away. But I had sampled sites both for bats and mega herbivores, and some for bats only. Bat surveys were, again, these acoustic surveys, as I'll highlight again a little later. For mega herbivores in particular, I was focused on the mega herbivore community because on a per individual basis, they would be having larger effects on the vegetation community than something like a springbok will. So I basically was doing dung transects around these bodies of water. They were 4 meters wide, and walked down and kind of had pins on either end where I would revisit each month, remove whatever was there, and identify all the dung piles that fell there, which included things like ear hairs all the way up to elephants. Across this landscape, because many of my sites fell in kind of the primary river channels, there's a lot more activity of elephants and giraffe than there are of rhinos. And I know rhinos have dung middens, black rhinos in this area, so that it is a little bit biased there, but kind of doing a sampling of all of this. We had rhino activity at a couple of our sites where it was predominantly rhinos, and the rest of them were predominantly elephants and giraffes using them. For vegetation, we ended up using, heavily relying on remote sensing. So we were using the normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, for both the dry and wet seasons, where we calculated the mean NDVI within a number of different buffer sizes and found that the 500 meter buffer was what suited this best for both mega herbivores and bats using these landscapes. But basically you can see the dry season here. And if you in particular pay attention around the words Sesfontein and palm bog, you'll see how much that kind of changes in the wet season. And it's really affecting more so the eastern side of our study area. However, I will say that there are little like minute differences, and these river systems, as you can see, like the Namib has kind of productivity year round in it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, for bats, we were using the same acoustic data set, so dry and wet season, and throwing this all together using structural equation modeling. So structural equation modeling, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically like a form of path analysis where you can have these linked linear models and can actually look for causal relationships using these. So rather than using individual univariate models and trying to relate them, this kind of tests everything at once. And in particular, we were testing 3 different hypotheses: whether mega herbivores directly impacted bat activity and species richness, or they indirectly affected bat activity and species richness via NDVI, or their impacts on vegetation productivity, or whether there were both direct and indirect effects that were happening in the system. And so and then we were comparing these models from the structural equation modeling using AIC model selection here. Our top model was the indirect relationship between mega herbivores and bats. And so I'm going to try to walk you through this. Basically, what you're seeing here, R squareds represent the amount of variation explained by the models up until that point in the model. And then the numbers with the arrows are basically like a partial effects. And you're looking at the strength of those relationships. All the arrows here are white. They're all significant. In a second, you'll see some gray ones, which are statistically insignificant. But what you'll gather from this model is that mega herbivores had a positive effect, it seems, on vegetation productivity, and then that in turn had a positive effect on both bat activity and species richness. So mega herbivores might be at low enough densities in this landscape that they're trimming vegetation and causing some regrowth that might be causing some of that green up. But one thing we also wanted to look at is not just our overall bat activity in the system, but the activity of different foraging fields. And so I mentioned before that there's like our free-tailed bats or open-air foraging bats. There's also bats that are adapted to feed on insects in really cluttered environments. And they might be picking insects off a leaf, like in like dense brush. And then there's other bats that are more adapted kind of for these edge habitats of dense vegetation and kind of open air. And so what I did is split up that activity based on the individual bats' foraging guilds, and found that that relationship with bat activity was actually being driven by a positive relationship with open air foraging bats. And to remind you, those are our mollosids, Robert's flat-headed bat, and the Egyptian free-tailed bat in this system. So I mentioned that they need to not only forage kind of in these open air environments, but to access water, they also need a generally like larger surface area to access. And so what I think might be happening, particularly for these species, is that by kind of curbing some of the vegetation around bodies of water, and at least knocking down some of that vegetation, they may actually be allowing more access for these bats to go both to drink and forage for insects just over bodies of water in this landscape. So that was in the dry season. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. But during the wet season, actually, none of these models had any significant relationships. And I think really, as I mentioned before, we know that elephants move away from these permanent forms of water during wet seasons. I think bats kind of do the same thing. They're going to areas where you have these insect blooms on the landscape. And why would you stay at a certain spot when these river channels provide all this abundance of food throughout? So they both kind of get decoupled from these permanent bodies of water during the wet season. So this suggested that the conservation of mega herbivores to me, given the positive relationships between particularly elephant and giraffe and bat activity and species richness, it might be indirectly promoting bat conservation and biodiversity in this landscape. So we know in other landscapes, there was a good study done in Zimbabwe on where elephant densities are much higher. We know that elephants actually can have a negative effect on bird communities in some of the woodlands. But I think here where elephant densities are low enough, they have kind of this positive effects on this insectivore community, at least in this landscape, and particularly for certain species of this insectivore community. But of course, the conservation of mega herbivores doesn't come without conflict. And so some of that was part of the last bit I'm going to talk about here. And I'm really going to kind of ignore more of the broader wildlife aspects of this study. But I did this was part of a social ecological study where not only was I interested in studying the bat communities and factors influencing that, but I was also interested in understanding how humans relate to wildlife in the system. In many parts of Africa, people eat bats, and like there's nothing known really for bats across much of Namibia. And so to me, I also wanted to identify if there were any conservation concerns or threats that we might be unaware of by just studying species away from people. So in general, I was doing a broader study looking at human wildlife values and attitudes towards wildlife. But then a subset of my questions was addressing how they relate to bats. So this produced two different papers. I'm going to focus on the listening to bats findings today. The other set of findings more on elephants and carnivores and how people relate to more of the conflict causing species is in the other paper mentioned below. And so this work was not possible without Archie. Archie served as a translator. He's from Sesfontaine Conservancy and can speak, he's Damara, but he can speak Herero and he can speak Afrikaans as well. And so we had 4 different ethnic groups in this area, and he was able to kind of communicate when folks were comfortable communicating in English, I would talk with them. And when not, he was kind of there as an in-between. So we kind of drove around the conservancies in these areas and asked people if they would be willing to talk to us about their interactions with wildlife. This led to 86 interviews, semi-structured interviews that took place across Sesfontein, Namib, and Tora Conservancy. Some of these interviews were with focus groups, and this was primarily for women who may not feel comfortable, in many cases did not feel comfortable speaking to us without another individual present, without their husband present or somebody else from the family. But the majority were with individuals. So as I mentioned before, we wanted to identify their knowledge of bats, the types and frequencies of interactions, and their attitudes and cultural stories about bats. So I mentioned this to you earlier. I showed everyone 3 photos before I even mentioned bats, and asked them, do you know what these animals are? And the majority of people would turn this upside down because of that fruit bat located on the right-hand side. But more than half identified these as bats. Other responses included things like jackals and hyenas and lions, focusing again on that fruit bat. Some thought birds or owls, which was pretty close. But when we provided an additional descriptor of animals that fly at night, everyone was able to identify them as bats. So they are familiar with these guys in the landscape, but to me, this suggests that not many people are seeing bats up close and personal. Even if they are, it's oftentimes in the dark and they don't get a good view of these things. I then asked a couple of questions. Where do you think bats like to sleep, eat, this kind of thing? Majority of people had reported houses in this case, some of which were occupied and some of which were abandoned. And this does suggest potentially a high level of contact between bats and humans. Trees and caves, rock crevices, these are all known roost of bats in these systems. And here's just an example of some horseshoe bats in Sesfontein in one of the abandoned camps that they have there. It's in their toilet block. So some folks, if they know you're looking for bats, if they know where they are, they'll always be like, you want to go see them? And I was like, sure. These guys are incredibly difficult for me to capture and miss nets. They're very good at avoiding nets. Easier to capture in harp traps, which are kind of, they look like a harp. They're vertical lines of string, but it was cool for me to see these guys. I've been recording them acoustically, but hadn't been capturing them a lot. So it's nice to know that they are here on the landscape. Moving on to the next question, what do you think bats like to eat? The majority of people said insects, and there are largely insectivorous bats in these communities. However, for areas around Sesfontein and possibly down to like Varmquella area, there are some fruit bats that use the area, and I actually found one all the way south in Tora Conservancy, but that was an African straw-colored fruit bat that got blown off course with the east winds, I think happens. It's total migrant or vagrant, and it probably did not survive because they're the ones that migrate in very large numbers to like forest in Zambia and shouldn't be found in the desert. However, of course, many of these bodies of water have date palms or fig trees in the vicinity, and so there is little pockets of habitat, and they find those. I hope that they survive, but they probably didn't. They come all the way into Swakopmund occasionally, I hear, when there's really bad east winds. You'll notice that some folks even identify mealypop, probably thinking of rodents maybe. And one individual talked about scorpion exoskeletons that he found underneath a spot where bat roosts. And we know that bats in other deserts, like the Engeve in Israel and in the southwest where I am, the Chihuahuan and Sonoran Desert, there are bats that specialize on hunting scorpions. And so this was a pretty cool finding to me. When we asked about frequencies, how often are you seeing bats? the majority of individuals are seeing bats on a nightly or weekly basis, which is a really high kind of potential contact rate, particularly when we have different seasons here. It's interesting to know that this happens throughout so much of the year. And then I asked questions, do you think bats are good or bad animals, and why? The majority actually gave positive responses to that, such as this gentleman here who said, in the old days, when there's too much rain and the grass was about knee-high, we used to make small huts to live in. The bats came in the huts and used to help us with the mosquitoes as well. We felt happy as the bats slept there as well. So this not only indicates positive attitudes towards them, but also the connection between bats and insect predation in the system. And when asked if bats should be conserved, it might be unsurprising that nearly everyone in these conservancies agreed that yes, they should be. However, when asked the same question about other species like lions and elephants, I will say that these numbers were a bit lower. They were still high, like over 70%, but many people are like, sure, like we'd like to conserve bats, and less so for animals that cause conflict. Of the people who had cultural stories, they were largely negative. So only about 40% of the interviews relied or related cultural stories. Of those, only about 12% thought they brought good luck. The majority thought they indicated bad luck or disease or death or drought. And one interesting finding for me, I've never heard of this anywhere else, is that people were really afraid of bats. The one very common cultural story is that bats, when they fly by your face, they can cut your ears off and cause them to rot. And to me, this kind of relates in a way to more in like Europe and North America, where people are really afraid of bats getting caught in their hair, but the ears and causing them to rot was a totally different thing for me. A lot of people told me they weren't sure if this was true, but they told their kids anyway. So they might not believe it themselves anymore, but it's something that might actually help with the protection of bats in this landscape. I will say that only a few people said that they've seen kids kill bats, but they usually get yelled at when they do, and get punished for it. And so stories like this may help protect them. There was no indication of anyone consuming bats, at least in the area of my surveys. They said potentially up by the Kunene River, but they didn't know anyone themselves. I will highlight that this kind of stuff can be something that changes pretty rapidly. And we had heard of cases in which people were killing bats and roosts during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we know that bats are potentially the species that cause the spillover of this virus. However, bats in other landscapes where I live in North America, they're very threatened by disease themselves that we as humans likely spread from cave to cave. White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that gets spread. They think it was from a caver who went caving in Europe and came back to New York and started kind of this spread that has really decimated our bat populations. And so the kind of moral of the story is it all is kind of entangled here, and you can't just do like a one snapshot. Like, it is important to understand how these cultural stories and attitudes towards wildlife might change. But with that, I think that's all I really have. I'll mention that Cecilia and I are here till next Friday, and we'll be doing some mist netting, hopefully over water holes eventually, but around the research center for a few nights, and anyone is welcome to come and visit and see. I can't promise that we'll capture a ton of bats, but you're more than welcome to kind of sit out and see what it's all about. And yeah, a whole bunch of funders to thank, and I tried to acknowledge the other folks along the way. So thank you guys.